The mahogany doors of courtroom 7B creaked open as Sarah Matthews stepped inside, her weathered Denny's uniform badge slightly crooked from her rushed change. After the morning rush, her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her warm leather purse while scanning the packed gallery. Tech billionaire James Chen sat at the defense table, his usual perfectly pressed suit replaced by something that made him look almost ordinary, while his former partner Timothy Walsh prowled like a caged lion on the plaintiff's side, his expensive Italian shoes tapping an anxious rhythm on the marble floor. The morning sunlight filtered through the towering windows, casting long shadows across the ornate courtroom as Sarah felt dozens of eyes following her every move. She recognized faces from the evening news, tech journalists, venture capitalists, and even a few celebrities who had invested in Chen's revolutionary artificial intelligence company Blitzcore. The air felt thick with anticipation and the faint scent of expensive cologne, mixing with the lingering aroma of coffee that seemed to follow her everywhere these days. Sarah unconsciously straightened her name tag, remembering how she'd grabbed her court clothes from her tiny studio apartment. After pulling a double shift, she hadn't even had time to remove her sensible work shoes, which squeaked slightly against the polished floor. As she made her way toward the witness stand, her cotton uniform, feeling desperately out of place among the sea of tailored suits and designer dresses that filled the gallery. Chen looked different than he did in the magazines, where he was always portrayed as the unstoppable tech genius who had revolutionized artificial intelligence. Today, he seemed smaller, somehow more human, his shoulders slightly hunched as he scribbled notes on a legal pad, his typical uniform of black turtleneck and blazer replaced by a simple gray suit that could have come from any department store. His quiet demeanor, a stark contrast to the larger-than-life persona that graced magazine covers. Across the aisle, Timothy Walsh exuded an energy that made Sarah want to take a step back. Even now, his perfectly styled silver hair and expertly tailored Italian suit couldn't hide the desperate anger that seemed to radiate from him in waves. His manicured fingers drummed against the table in an endless rhythm that matched the tapping of his shoes, his eyes darting between Chen and his own legal team like a man watching a game of chess where he already knew he was losing. The courthouse security guards stood at attention, their backs straightening as Judge Eleanor Harrison swept into the room, her black robes billowing slightly as she ascended to the bench, her steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her reputation as one of the toughest judges in the Southern District of New York. Sarah watched as the judge adjusted her reading glasses, peering down at the case file before her with the kind of scrutiny that had made her famous in legal circles. Sarah felt her heart pounding as she realized this moment would change everything. Her simple life of serving coffee and collecting tips suddenly seemed a million miles away from this wood-paneled courtroom where billions of dollars and the fate of one of the world's largest tech companies hung in the balance. She could feel the weight of her testimony pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing, knowing that her words about that ordinary night shift would either destroy or save the reputation of the quiet man sitting at the defense table. The gallery rustled with whispers as Chen's attorney rose from his seat. His reputation for ruthless cross-examination preceded him, but it was the gentle smile Chen gave Sarah as she was sworn in that somehow made her hands steady and her spine straighten. She might be just a waitress, but she knew the truth about what happened that night, and no amount of expensive suits or legal maneuvering could change what she had seen. Gasps echoed through the courthouse as the security footage played on the massive screen mounted above the jury box. The black and white video, timestamped 3:17 a.m., showed the familiar interior of the 24-hour Denny's where Sarah had worked for the past 3 years, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the nearly empty restaurant save for a few tired truckers nursing their coffee cups, and James Chen sitting alone in booth 7, his laptop open beside a half-eaten slice of apple pie. The quality of the footage was grainy but clear enough to show every detail of what happened next. Walsh appeared at the diner's entrance like a storm, rolling in his $1,000 suit, wrinkled from what looked like hours of waiting, his usually perfectly coiffed hair disheveled, as though he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. The night manager, Gloria, could be seen looking up from her crossword puzzle with concern as Walsh scanned the dining room like a predator seeking prey. The entire courtroom held its collective breath as they watched Walsh spot Chen, the timestamps clicking forward, showing how Walsh stood there for exactly 47 seconds, just staring at his former partner before stalking across the checkerboard floor tiles. Several members of the jury leaned forward in their seats as Walsh approached Chen's booth, clutching a thick manila envelope so tightly his knuckles showed white even in the grainy footage. Sarah watched herself on screen approaching the table, coffee pot in hand, completely unaware of the drama about to unfold. Shen never looked up from his pie, even as Walsh slammed the envelope down, sending silverware clattering to the floor. The security footage had no audio, but Walsh's rage was evident in every movement, his face contorted as he shouted words that made several customers grab their coats and hurry toward the exit. Chen methodically cut another piece of pie, lifting it to his mouth with the same deliberate calm he showed now sitting at the defense table. The gallery murmured as Walsh began pulling papers from the envelope, throwing them one by one at Chen. Printouts of coat emails, financial documents, they scattered across the table like confetti at a funeral, some floating to the floor, while others landed in Chen's coffee cup. The timestamp showed this went on for 3 full minutes, Shen never raising his voice, never even looking up, just continuing to eat his pie, as though he were alone in the restaurant. Sarah watched her past self hovering at the edge of the frame, trying to decide whether to intervene, the worry evident even in her grainy video double. While Walsh grew more agitated by Chen's apparent indifference, the footage showed Walsh grabbing Chen's laptop, shoving it across the table. Several jurors gasped as coffee spilled across the expensive device, but still Chen remained unmoved, cutting another precise bite of his pie, while Walsh turned redder by the second. Present day. Walsh shifted uncomfortably in his chair as the video showed him becoming more erratic, throwing sugar packets, napkin holders, and finally upending an entire table, his expensive watch catching the fluorescent light as he swept everything onto the floor. Some of the journalists in the gallery were frantically taking notes, while others simply stared transfixed at the unfolding scene. Shen remained sitting, his posture relaxed, his movements unhurried as he finished the last bite of his pie, placed a neat stack of bills on the table, and finally looked up at his former friend with what could only be described as profound sadness. The timestamp blinked, 3:27 a.m., marking exactly 10 minutes since Walsh had entered the diner, 10 minutes that would lead them all to this courtroom. Sarah felt her hands grow clammy as she watched, knowing what came next, the moment that would change everything. The tension in the courtroom crackled like static electricity as Sarah sat in the witness box, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Just like she'd practiced the night before in front of her bathroom mirror, she could feel every eye in the room boring into her as Chen's attorney asked her to describe what happened next. After the security footage ended, her voice came out steadier than she expected as she began to speak. The diner had gone completely silent that night, Sarah explained, like the quiet before a hurricane hits. Even the usual clinking of dishes from the kitchen had stopped as everyone watched Walsh standing over Chen, his breathing so heavy it was audible across the restaurant. She described how Walsh had started pacing between the tables, his designer shoes leaving scuff marks on the recently mopped floor, while he ranted about betrayal and stolen dreams. Sarah leaned forward in the witness chair, remembering how Walsh had begun spouting technical terms that she'd never heard before, something about quantum algorithms and neural networks that would change the world, terms that meant nothing to her then, but she'd since Googled trying to understand that night better. She recalled how Walsh had claimed Chen had stolen everything they'd worked on for 15 years, saying that he'd taken their shared vision and twisted it into something unrecognizable. The jury listened intently as Sarah described the moment Walsh had completely snapped, grabbing the coffee pot from her serving tray and hurling it against the wall, sending scalding liquid and glass shards spraying across booth 6. She remembered how the elderly couple who'd been sitting there had scrambled away, leaving their half-eaten pancakes behind, while Walsh continued his tirade about patent applications and stolen source code. What struck her most, Sarah testified, was Chen's remarkable stillness throughout the entire ordeal. Like the eye of a storm, he sat there watching Walsh with an expression she now recognized as deep concern. She described how Walsh had begun pulling at his own hair, pacing faster and muttering equations under his breath, numbers and letters that seemed to make sense only to him, while Chen remained seated, his hands folded on the table, just watching and waiting. Sarah shifted in her seat as she recalled the scariest part, how Walsh had started talking about revenge, about making things right, about showing the world who James Chen really was. She described the wild look in his eyes as he grabbed a bottle of ketchup from a nearby table and sprayed it across the front of Chen's simple gray suit, shouting that now everyone would see the blood on his hands. Chen had simply dabbed at the stain with a napkin, his movements precise and unhurried. The courtroom remained silent as Sarah explained how she'd worked in food service for 12 years and learned to read people to spot trouble before it started. She'd seen that look in Walsh's eyes before in customers who'd had too much to drink or were about to start a fight, but this was different, more desperate, more dangerous. She described how Walsh had begun throwing anything he could grab, salt shakers, plates, utensils, all while screaming about algorithms that could predict human behavior and change the course of history. Chen nodded almost imperceptibly as Sarah described his continued silence, his refusal to engage or escalate. Even as chaos erupted around him, she noticed how present-day Walsh had stopped his nervous tapping and was now staring at his former partner with a mixture of shame and lingering anger. While she spoke about the growing madness of that night, that the worst was yet to come, and Sarah took a deep breath knowing she would have to describe the moment everything changed, the moment that brought them all to this courtroom. Judge Harrison perched forward on her leather chair, the thick lenses of her glasses catching the fluorescent light as Sarah began describing the pivotal moment that transformed an ordinary night shift into something that would make headlines across the tech world. The young waitress rose from the witness stand at the attorney's request to demonstrate exactly how Shed positioned herself between the two tech titans, her movements precise and confident despite her shaking hands. Holding her serving tray in front of her, Sarah showed how Shed first noticed Walsh eyeing the steak knife that lay abandoned on table 4, his fingers twitching as his rants about stolen technology and betrayed trust grew more incoherent. She explained how years of breaking up bar fights and calming angry customers had taught her to read body language like a book, how she recognized the telltale signs of someone about to do something they'd regret forever. The gallery watched transfixed as Sarah recreated her movements, describing how Shed silently slid between tables, positioning herself just close enough to reach Walsh if needed but far enough away to maintain what Shed learned in a self-defense class was a safe reactionary gap. She demonstrated how Shed kept her serving tray tilted at precisely the right angle to use as an improvised shield, while simultaneously pressing the silent alarm button under the counter with her hip, a move Shed practiced countless times during security drills. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she described watching Walsh's reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser while pretending to wipe down a nearby table, how Shed seeing his hand inch closer to the knife, while his voice rose higher, speaking faster about neural networks and market manipulation, his words tumbling over each other in a frenzied stream of consciousness. She explained how Chen had finally looked up from his ruined suit, kneeing Walsh's thighs for the first time that night, speaking just 2 words: "We tried." Those simple words, Sarah testified, seemed to snap something in Walsh. She demonstrated how Head lunged for the knife, her serving tray already in motion. As she stepped between them, the entire courtroom leaned forward as she showed how Shed deflected his arm, using techniques Shed learned from watching professional hockey with her father, describing how the knife had spun through the air, catching the fluorescent lights before clattering against the checkered floor somewhere near the jukebox. Several jurors gasped as Sarah recreated how Shed used her tray to guide Walsh away from the weapon, her movements fluid and automatic like a dance Shed practiced 1,000 times. She described how Shed spoken to him firmly but kindly, the way she talked down drunk college students during late night shifts, telling him that whatever had happened between him and Chen wasn't worth destroying his life over. She remembered the exact moment the fight had left his body, his shoulders slumping as he sank into the nearest booth. Present-day Chen nodded slowly as Sarah described how Head finally stood, then approaching his former partner with careful measured steps, how Head placed a gentle hand on Walsh's shoulder and said something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Walsh in the courtroom now wiped at his eyes with an expensive silk handkerchief as Sarah recounted how both men had sat in silence for several long minutes while police sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer to the diner. Judge Harrison adjusted her glasses, studying the serving tray Sarah still held, asking her to explain what had made her risk her own safety to protect a stranger. Sarah lowered the tray, her fingers tracing the small dents that still marked its surface as she prepared to reveal the surprising truth that would change the direction of the entire trial. The courtroom erupted in chaos as Chen's attorney rose from his seat, holding a slim black tablet, his fingers dancing across the screen before dozens of emails appeared on the massive display behind him. The timestamps show a clear progression over the past 5 years, revealing a story that made several jurors lean forward in their seats and caused Walsh to sink lower into his expensive leather chair, his face draining of color as his own words appeared larger than life. The first email, dated exactly 5 years ago, showed Walsh bragging about a massive win at the Bellagio Casino in Las Vegas, the exact same day he had signed over his shares in Blitzcore to Chen for what now seemed like a pittance compared to the company's current value. The gallery buzzed with whispers as email after email appeared, showing Walsh celebrating his gambling victories, living a life of luxury while Chen worked endless hours building their shared dream into a $1 billion empire. Chen stood suddenly, his quiet voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife as he approached the evidence screen, his simple gray suit a stark contrast to the expensive clothing he usually wore in public. He began explaining how he'd watched his friend spiral into addiction, how he'd tried intervention after intervention offering to buy back Walsh's shares at current market value if he would just get help. Walsh stared at his former partner, his hands trembling as Chen revealed how he'd kept a position open for him all these years, believing his friend would eventually find his way back. The evidence continued to mount as bank statements flashed across the screen showing how Walsh had borrowed millions from underground casinos and loan sharks using his former connection to Blitzscore as collateral. Chen described finding Walsh sleeping in his car outside the company's headquarters 6 months ago, how he'd offered him a place to stay, rehabilitation, whatever he needed, but Walsh had been too far gone, convinced that Chen had somehow orchestrated his downfall to steal their shared technology. Sarah watched from the witness stand as Walsh's carefully constructed narrative began to crumble, the jury examining documents showing that the revolutionary algorithm Walsh claimed Chen had stolen hadn't even existed when he was part of the company. Text messages reveal how Chen had continued paying Walsh's health insurance for years after he left, keeping his name on company documents as a silent partner, even as Walsh lost millions at underground poker games. The most damaging evidence came in the form of security footage from the Blitzscore offices, showing Walsh attempting to break in late at night using his old keycard, which Chen had never deactivated. Walsh's face crumpled as the video played, showing him being gently escorted out by security. Chen hitting orders not to press charges. Emails followed showing Chen making arrangements for Walsh to enter an exclusive rehabilitation facility, all expenses paid, only to have Walsh check himself out after 3 days. Present day, Walsh finally broke his silence, rising unsteadily to his feet, his voice barely a whisper as he admitted that had convinced himself the elaborate conspiracy theory was real, but in his addled mind it was easier to believe Chen had betrayed him than to face the truth about his own choices. The jury watched in stunned silence as this once powerful tech executive began to cry, describing how he'd lost everything: his marriage, his home, his reputation, all while Chen kept trying to save him. Judge Harrison adjusted her reading glasses, examining a final piece of evidence, a letter Chen had written to Walsh just 1 week before the diner incident, begging his old friend to accept help one last time, offering not just rehabilitation, but a chance to rebuild his life. The courtroom fell silent as Chen approached Walsh, now their shared history of friendship, innovation, and betrayal hanging in the air between them. What happened next would change not just their lives, but Sarah's as well. You could hear a pin drop as Walsh's assistant Emily took the stand, tears streaming down her face as she unveiled the dark truth about her boss's spiral into addiction, how she'd found him sleeping in his office surrounded by lottery tickets and racing forms, how he'd borrowed money from loan sharks to fund his habit. Chen watched his old friend crumble on the stand, his own eyes glistening with tears, for the brilliant partner had lost to the demons of addiction. Judge Harrison removed her reading glasses, placing them carefully on the bench before delivering her ruling, her voice echoing through the hushed courtroom as she not only dismissed Walsh's lawsuit with prejudice, but also mandated a comprehensive rehabilitation program. The tension in the room shifted as she spoke directly to Walsh, reminding him that sometimes losing a case could be winning a second chance at life. What happened next sent whispers rippling through the gallery as Chen stood slowly straightening his simple gray suit and walked directly toward his former partner and friend, ignoring his attorney's attempt to stop him. Walsh looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and uncertain as Chen approached. Chen extended his hand, but instead of the formal handshake everyone expected, he pulled Walsh into a tight embrace. The two men who had once dreamed of changing the world together stood locked in an emotional reunion that brought tears to several jurors' eyes. Chen spoke quietly at first, his voice growing stronger as he addressed not just Walsh but the entire courtroom. He talked about their days in a garage startup, eating ramen noodles and dreaming impossible dreams. He reminded Walsh of the night they first cracked the quantum encryption algorithm, how they'd celebrated with cheap champagne in plastic cups, believing they could accomplish anything as long as they stuck together. The gallery watched transfixed as Chen pulled out his phone, showing Walsh a photo had kept all these years of their first office, a converted storage closet with 2 desks crammed together. Walsh trembled as Chen announced his plans for Blitzscore's new mental health technology division, explaining how their original dream of using artificial intelligence to help people could be redirected toward addiction recovery and support. Chen offered Walsh not charity, but purpose a chance to help build something meaningful again. The position would come with strict oversight, regular counseling, and a board-approved recovery program, but it would also give Walsh the opportunity to transform his own struggles into hope for others. The courtroom buzzed with excitement as Chen detailed how their breakthrough in predictive algorithms could be adapted to identify addiction triggers and provide early intervention. He spoke passionately about using technology to create a support network for people fighting their own battles, explaining how Walsh's experience could prove invaluable in developing these systems. Walsh's attorneys exchanged shocked glances as Chen's legal team scrambled to draft preliminary paperwork for this unexpected turn of events. Sarah watched from her seat as Chen turned to address Judge Harrison, formally requesting that the court allow him to submit a modified rehabilitation plan, one that would combine traditional recovery methods with innovative technology-driven support systems. The judge leaned forward with interest as Chen explained how this could become a pilot program for helping other executives and professionals who found themselves caught in the spiral of addiction and despair. Walsh stood on shaky legs, his voice barely above a whisper, as he asked Chen why, after everything that had happened. Chen simply smiled, that same patient smile had worn in the diner, speaking about second chances, redemption, and the power of friendship to overcome even the darkest moments. Several members of the gallery dabbed at their eyes as Chen reminded Walsh that their company had been built on the belief that technology could make the world better, and now they had a chance to prove it. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as the two former partners turned current adversaries began discussing their new project, their animated conversation about neural networks and support algorithms reminiscent of their early days as hungry young entrepreneurs. But before they could get too far into the technical details, Chen turned his attention to Sarah, his expression thoughtful, as he studied the young waitress who had shown such remarkable judgment in a crisis. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Chen approached Sarah, his movements deliberate and measured while everyone in the courtroom watched with bated breath. Sarah straightened her waitress uniform, suddenly conscious of the coffee stains and small tears that marked a dozen late-night shifts. She expected perhaps a handshake, a thank you, or maybe even a generous tip. Instead, Chen pulled a pristine business card from his wallet, holding it out to her with both hands in a gesture that reminded her of the way her Japanese grandmother had always presented gifts. The gallery leaned forward, straining to hear, as Chen explained how he'd spent the last 3 weeks reviewing security footage of the diner incident, watching frame by frame how Sarah had assessed the situation, protected others, and diffused a volatile situation without ever raising her voice or showing fear. He described how Shed demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment, crisis management, and human understanding that his company desperately needed, especially now as they launched their most ambitious and sensitive project yet. Sarah's hands trembled as she examined the business card, embossed with a Blitzcore logo in subtle silver, letting her fingertips trace the raised letters of the title. Chen was offering her Executive Director of Crisis Intervention and Human Resources. The salary he mentioned made her drop the card, catching it quickly before it fluttered to the floor. It was more money than Shed made in 20 years of serving coffee and collecting tips. Chen smiled, explaining that the number reflected not just the position, but his absolute confidence in her abilities. Walsh stepped forward, then his own eyes bright with unshed tears, as he described how Sarah's intervention had not only prevented a tragedy, but had given him the wake-up call he so desperately needed. He told the court how her words that night about choices and consequences had played over and over in his mind during his first week of rehabilitation. Chen nodded, adding that Sarah's unique combination of street smarts, emotional intelligence, and grace under pressure would be invaluable as they developed their mental health support programs. The judge watched with interest as Chen outlined the position in more detail, explaining how Sarah would help develop protocols for identifying and managing crisis situations, while also overseeing the human element of their new rehabilitation technology initiative. Her real-world experience dealing with people at their lowest moments, he explained, would provide insights that no amount of artificial intelligence could replicate. Sarah listened overwhelmed as Chen described how she'd be working directly with both him and Walsh, overseeing a team of counselors and technology specialists. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks as Chen revealed that Sarah would also be granted stock options in Blitzcore, making her not just an employee but a partner in the company's future. Several members of the jury smiled as Sarah struggled to process this complete transformation of her life happening in real time, her coffee-stained apron and sensible shoes suddenly seeming like artifacts from a different lifetime entirely. Walsh surprised everyone by adding his own endorsement, explaining how Sarah's ability to see past his expensive suit and recognizing the desperate person beneath had quite literally saved his life. Chen agreed, describing how in those crucial moments, Sarah had demonstrated more wisdom and compassion than many of his highest-paid executives. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Chen handed Sarah a second document, this one a formal job offer requiring only her signature to begin her journey from waitress to executive. Sarah stood speechless in the middle of courtroom 7B. The same steel and determination that had helped her handle countless difficult customers now reflected in her eyes as she realized that her instinct to protect a stranger that night had opened a door she never knew existed. Chen extended his hand, offering not just a job, but a chance to transform her own experience into something that could help others, while Walsh watched with genuine gratitude, the fluorescent lights still humming overhead as Sarah reached out to shake Chen's hand, accepting not just a position, but a whole new destiny that had begun with nothing more than a late-night shift at a 24-hour diner. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows of courtroom 7B, casting long shadows across the polished floor as Chen rose from his seat, his simple gray suit a stark contrast to the power he wielded in the tech world. He approached the bench, his footsteps echoing in the hushed chamber, while every eye in the room followed his movement. Judge Harrison leaned forward with interest as Chen began to speak, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. What followed next would make headlines across every tech publication in Silicon Valley. Chen announced that Blitzcore would be launching a revolutionary new division focused entirely on mental health and addiction recovery, using their advanced AI technology to create early warning systems and support networks for people struggling with gambling addiction. Walsh looked up sharply from his seat, his eyes wide with disbelief as Chen explained how their original dream of using technology to help people would finally be realized in a way neither of them had imagined. The gallery buzzed with excitement as Chen detailed his plans for using their quantum algorithms to predict and prevent addiction triggers while simultaneously developing support systems that could reach people before they hit rock bottom. Sarah watched from her seat as Chen described how their AI could analyze patterns in behavior and communication, offering help precisely when it was needed most. Walsh sat straighter with each word, his expertise in behavioral prediction algorithms suddenly relevant in a way he never expected. But Chen wasn't finished. He turned to Walsh, speaking directly to his old friend and partner about redemption and second chances. He offered Walsh not just a position in the new division, but a chance to lead it, explaining how no one understood both the technology and the struggle better than someone who had lived it. Walsh's hands trembled as Chen outlined the stringent oversight and recovery requirements that would come with the position, but also the opportunity to transform his own darkness into light for others. Emily wiped tears from her eyes as Chen acknowledged her role in trying to save Walsh, announcing that she would be promoted to chief of staff for the new division responsible for building bridges between the technical teams and the human support services. Her years of watching over Walsh had given her insights that no algorithm could match, Chen explained, while Sarah nodded in understanding, finally seeing how all the pieces would fit together. Then Chen turned to Sarah, and the entire courtroom held its breath. The simple business card he held out to her might have seemed anticlimactic after everything that had happened, but the title, printed in elegant silver letters, made several reporters gasp. Director of Crisis Intervention and Human Assessment. Chen explained how Sarah's instincts that night in the diner had demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment they needed, someone who could see past surfaces to the human beings beneath. The salary Chen mentioned made Sarah grip the edge of her chair to steady herself. It was more money than she would make in 20 years of serving coffee. But it wasn't just about the money. Chen explained how she would work directly with both him and Walsh, helping to develop protocols for identifying and managing crisis situations, while also overseeing the human element of their new technology. Her real-world experience dealing with people at their worst moments would provide insights that no amount of artificial intelligence could replicate. Walsh stood then, his voice stronger than it had been in months, as he described his own vision for combining their technical expertise with Sarah's practical experience and Emily's organizational skills to create something entirely new, a system that could catch people before they fell as far as he had. Judge Harrison smiled as she watched the former partners finding their way back to their original dream of using technology to make the world better. Chen wasn't finished, though. He turned back to the judge, requesting that the court allow him to submit a modified rehabilitation plan, one that would combine traditional recovery methods with their innovative technology-driven support systems. He suggested using Walsh's case as a pilot program to demonstrate how their approach could help other executives and professionals who found themselves caught in the spiral of addiction and despair. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as Chen pulled out one final document, a founding charter for the new division that required 4 signatures, his own, Walsh's, Emily's, and Sarah's. He explained how each of them would be granted equity in this new venture, making them not just employees but partners in its success. Sarah stared at the paper, her coffee-stained uniform, suddenly feeling like a costume from another life entirely as she realized that her simple act of courage had opened doors she never knew existed. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks as Chen outlined the next steps. Walsh would begin intensive rehabilitation. While working with their development team, Emily would start building the organizational structure and Sarah would split her time between training and helping design their intervention protocols. The judge approved each proposal, noting that sometimes the best judgments were the ones that offer hope instead of punishment. As Sarah signed her name on the charter, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window, no longer seeing a waitress but someone who had found her true calling. Walsh hugged Chen for the first time in years, whispering thank you while Emily began making notes in her ever-present notebook, already planning their next moves. The afternoon sun continued its journey across the courtroom floor, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like possibilities. Judge Harrison struck her gavel one final time, but it wasn't an ending, it was a beginning for four people whose lives had collided in a late-night diner and emerged transformed. Chen gathered them together, explaining how their first task would be to create a system that could identify the kind of desperate loneliness that had driven Walsh to rock bottom and the kind of instinctive compassion that had led Sarah to step forward that night. As they left the courtroom together, Sarah felt the weight of her serving tray replaced by the lightness of purpose. Walsh stood straighter with each step, Emily's notebook now filled with hope instead of worry, and Chen smiled knowing that sometimes the best innovations come from understanding